I tried to figure out where my journey to Latin America started. I think actually it started in high school. I grew up in Southern California. I will tell you the town I live in, and we will see this great generational divide because half of you will laugh and half of you won't know why they're laughing. I grew up in Whittier.
Oh.
See? Works every time. I grew up in Richard Nixon's hometown while he was president. And I grew up on the wrong side of Whittier. I grew up in the Latino part of town. My high school was 70% Latino, mostly the sons and daughters of first-generation Mexican immigrants.
You lucked out.
I totally lucked out. It also turns out, I didn't know this until not too long ago, I was rummaging through a stack of papers that my dear mother had saved. She saved a whole bunch of my papers from elementary school, as really nice mothers do. And there was this funny crayon drawing of the Capitol building in La Paz that said Government Building Bolivia. Why I drew this in the first grade, I have no idea, but maybe it planted itself. My real journey to Latin America, though, began during the height of the war in Nicaragua. In 1986, I went to Nicaragua as part of a witness delegation, a fact-finding delegation by people who, like me, worked in and around the state capitol. After I graduated college in political science at Berkeley, I spent the next 10 years working in and around the state capitol in California. I was legislative staff, and I was the lobbyist for Common Cause and for Consumers Union. And a group of us from the Capitol decided in July of 1986 that we would go to Nicaragua for a few weeks and learn what we could learn. And I will not forget the day that a group of people we were supposed to meet with didn't show up because their vehicle hit a landmine, and we instead went to their funerals in Matagalpa. These are things that I felt, obviously, in a very deep way. And then I saw the other side of how this works, which is the last day there, we went to the US Embassy. And I remember feeling, imagine how you feel going through this experience. And I walked into the doors of the US Embassy, and there's this elaborate display of posters about amateur athletics in the United States. And then we met with this young guy. I was 27, I think, at the time, 28. And he was about my age. And I had never met him, but I knew him because I had just recently graduated with a master's degree from the Kennedy School at Harvard. And I was like, I went to school with you. I went to school with a whole bunch of you guys, this clean cut, working their way up the professional ladder, smiling, and completely oblivious to reality, which tells you one lesson about Latin America, which is you could be there and still not be there. Mm-hmm. Right. It's extremely easy to be there and not be there, to be in the bubble. I came home from that trip, and I remember this experience really well. I lived in the Haight in San Francisco, and I remember walking down Haight Street and thinking to myself, don't you realize what's happening? And I started crying. I was like, don't you realize that this is happening right now? Kind of the way you feel after you've lost somebody, after the death in a family. You think, don't you realize the world is completely different than it was yesterday? That's how I felt. And I think that settled into my heart in a way that I could never, ever let go of. For 5 years after that, I was a passionate activist with the religious community in San Francisco to end aid to the Contras and then end aid to the war in El Salvador. One of my greatest lessons as an advocate actually comes from that experience. I'll share it with you. Every year on December 2nd, we had a vigil. I don't know if you know San Francisco. We had a vigil in Union Square, which is this sort of plaza in the middle of the city that nobody really goes to because it's off the main commercial strip. And every year the same 30 or 40 of us would gather and bear witness. We would bear witness. And why December 2nd? Some of you know that. It's because that was the day that the 4 American churchwomen were killed in El Salvador. And that was the day that we would do this. And it's important to understand, and I think it's a lesson for our times, sometimes you can't make any progress, but you bear witness. You bear witness because you just never know. And every year we did this. Every year we called on the Congress to hold a hearing. We couldn't even get the Senate of the United States to hold a debate before they allocated the 3rd largest foreign aid package that the country had at the time. Israel, Egypt, El Salvador. Except Israel, Egypt, big countries, El Salvador, same amount of money almost. And then, in November of 1989, the army of El Salvador marched in to the University of Central America campus in San Salvador and slaughtered the entire community of Jesuit priests and their housekeeper and their housekeeper's daughter. Anybody here remember that event?
Yes.
And that little vigil that we had in Union Square of 20 or 30 people, suddenly we had 1,000 people who were saying, what can I do? And I'm going to share these little details just because they're the details of advocacy. I was walking down the street about 2 weeks before this, when we knew we were going to have a big event, and somebody, little inspiration, somebody had painted 1,000 cranes for peace. They had painted little origami cranes on the ground. And I thought, yes, we should not be gathered in Union Square. We should get signs with the pictures of the 4 churchwomen. We should stand with candles and informational flyers, and we should stand 10 feet apart, the length of Market Street. On that December 2nd, you could not walk in downtown San Francisco without turning a corner and seeing as far as the eye could see, block after block after block, people holding candles and signs. There was one member of that religious community, one of the Jesuits who survived. His name was John Sobrino. And he's well known. He's, in some respects, the godfather of liberation theology. He was in Thailand at the time, and his layover back was through San Francisco, and he was our friend. And he came to the vigil and he did the homily in the church. We went from being ignored to having 60 Minutes and all these other big news outlets calling us to help them put together stories. We had Congress people calling us, asking for our help putting together hearings. And within a few months, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, made a political calculation that it was no longer willing to expend its political capital to write blank checks to the government of El Salvador. And that is the primary reason that the government of El Salvador at the time, the right-wing government, agreed to go to the negotiating table with the rebels at the UN and negotiate a peace settlement. And I lift up that story because it tells you that even when the moment is dark, even when hope is hard to find, you bear witness. You bear witness because you do not know when events will come looking for you. And if we had not done that, I don't know that all the events that followed would have happened. You bear witness. So that was my experience in working in Central America. In the summer of 1987, when I was a lobbyist at the state capitol, I sat down and had the first real conversation that I'd ever had with this young woman. She was from here. I was from California. She was from West Seneca, of all places. And it turns out that we had this dream in common, which is we both wanted to leave the United States, go somewhere in Latin America off the beaten path, and spend a year being volunteers. 3 years to the day almost after that, we got married. 30 years to the day after that, we held our first granddaughter. And in between, we ended up living 19 years in Bolivia. We first went as newlyweds. We just jumped off a cliff. We were living in San Francisco. We quit our jobs. We took a few things that we had, put them in storage, got rid of the rest, and had enough money to maybe live on for 6 months. And we agreed to become volunteers in a place called Cochabamba at an orphanage. An orphanage. So we explicitly did not go down there to be political, despite the fact that we were very political people. And it was a great experience because for a year, those fancy master's degrees that we had, mine from Harvard, hers from Berkeley, meant nothing. They meant nothing whatsoever. Our life for a year was to work with a group of children from 1-year-old to 10 to help them understand that they had value, to teach them the multiplication tables, to teach them art, to sort crayons, to not eat Play-Doh. And this was our life in a place called Cochabamba. Cochabamba is a glorious place. Cochabamba is a valley 8,000 feet high in the Andes with the climate of Southern California. It's a beautiful place. Now that's 8,000 feet is not actually very high in Bolivia. The capital, the airport at the capital in La Paz is 13,000 feet. So you're almost halfway to cruising before you leave the tarmac. And we had this extraordinary experience for a year in Bolivia. We ran out of money. We lived on nothing. We spent our first year of marriage, those of you who have had the experience of long marriages, we spent our first year of marriage never apart for longer than 8 hours. We started a school, and neither of us were teachers. We lived in this strange place, and as a grand finale on our way out the door, we unexpectedly adopted a 5-year-old girl who is in labor at this moment, having our second grandchild. I've written a book about this. I'm not going to get into lots of the personal things. I've just finished a book, and we release it next month, called My Other Country, 19 Years in Bolivia. It's a family memoir, and it has politics, but mostly it has a lot of family stuff in it. And mark the date, on April 7th at 7 p.m., we will do one of our first events at the Buen Vivir Gallery on Elmwood. So April 7th at 7 p.m. Come to that. It will be lots of fun. So we lived in Bolivia for that year. And I had actually been asked by Pacific News Service at the time if I would do dispatches from Bolivia. And about midway through, I wrote back to them and I said, yeah, no. I'm not here to do that. I'm not here as a journalist. I'm not here as a political I am here to be with these kids, and that's what I'm doing, and so thanks, but no thanks. Later, we went back, and we ended up adopting our son, Miguel. Our eldest daughter's name is Elizabeth. Miguel, our son. They're now 33 and 32. They live together in the orphanage. So Miguel came later to live with us in San Francisco, and in 1998, when we were trying to figure out where to go since we couldn't afford to live in San Francisco anymore as nonprofit people, we decided we would dodge the bullet of the suburbs by moving back for a year to Cochabamba. We stayed for 19, which means that for 19 years we had a storage unit in San Francisco with my son's Tonka trucks, my daughter's Barbies, and a broken VCR because I was so convinced we would want it when we came back and I would fix it. So we had a family time capsule. So we moved back to Bolivia, and we were there for 19 years. And for the first year, I was writing a book that had nothing to do with Bolivia. It's a great book on advocacy. It's called The Democracy Owner's Manual. The Democracy Owner's Manual. And in the middle of that, Bolivia came calling to me in a different way through something that became known as the Cochabamba Water Revolt. Has anybody ever heard of the Cochabamba Water Revolt? The Cochabamba Water Revolt.
Time
También la lluvia.
También la lluvia. So I ended up not only being in the middle of the Cochabamba Water Revolt, but I ended up being the person who brought that story out of Bolivia into the rest of the world. And it was the formational experience of my time in Bolivia. So the story goes like this. The World Bank, in its infinite wisdom, during the time of the Washington Consensus, decided that the way to solve the water problem in places like Bolivia was for the public water systems to be privatized into the hands of multinational corporations. Now, look, they had a point. It was a corrupt and poorly run and poorly financed water system. You could make an argument, I didn't agree with it, but you could make an argument for privatization. But that's not what they did. They didn't say, we've done an analysis, we think this is the best way forward. They said, do it, or you will not get any more loans from us to expand water access in Bolivia. Those of you who are young in the room, when you were teenagers, did you get an allowance from your parents? Yeah? Did you have to do anything to get your allowance?
Yeah.
What'd you have to do?
The dishwasher. The dishes.
Everything you need to know about the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, you know from that experience. Because that is exactly the way they operate. But instead of do the dishes or no allowance, it's privatize your water system or no more loans. It's the same power dynamic. And so, did you do the dishes?
Yeah.
Of course you did the dishes. Did they privatize the water system? Of course they privatized the water system. Now, the government at the time, which was the former dictator Hugo Banzer, was also quite eager to do things that foreign corporations in Washington and the rest would like. Yes, there was probably a little bit of this involved as well, no doubt, because they put it out for bid and there was just one company. Just one company, this mysterious company called Aguas del Tunari. Tunari is the mountain peak, 15,500 feet high. I know the height because I hiked it to the top, and it's hard. That sits behind Cochabamba. And so here comes this new mysterious company, new logo on the water bills, and within 2 months, they raise the rates on water, sometimes by double, sometimes by more. One of the people I interviewed in the midst of this was a woman named Tanya Paredes who knitted baby clothes for a living. Her water bill was equal to what it cost her to feed her family for a third of the month. People literally were forced to decide whether or not they were going to have water coming out of the tap or whether they were going to feed their families. You know what Bolivians do when that happens? What Americans do when that happens is they complain. Stupid ass company, or I hate the government, and they complain and then they basically take it. Bolivians, not as educated, none of those things, they just said, ya no pues, eso no va a pasar. No, we're not paying our bills. And we're going to blockade the highways. And the cool thing about Bolivia is the main highways in Bolivia that connect the cities run about from that chair to that chair in width, if that. It doesn't take a lot of people with rocks to literally shut off commerce in a country of 10 million people. You just close the highways. And then people shut down the city of Cochabamba. What's the population of Buffalo?
250,000.
Okay, I want you to picture a city twice the size of Buffalo, completely shut down by a general strike. The schools are closed, the businesses are closed, you can't drive anywhere. It's carajo. Don't you get it? We're done. The first time they did this in January of 2000, so we're 20 years ago, the government was taken back and said, okay, we'll study this. And they said, okay, we're going to give you 3 weeks. Then after the 3 weeks were passed and the government hadn't done anything, they said, my friends in the labor unions, this was a coalition of labor unions and rural people and city people and middle class and poor, all of which, and they said, okay, we're going to do a protest. We're going to take the plaza. Now, if you were a kid once and you played capture the flag, that's how it works in Latin American politics. The plaza is the flag, and you take control of it, and that shows you're powerful. So when the protesters announced they were going to take the plaza, the government said they can't take the flag. So they sent in hundreds of police to block people from taking the plaza. And then this turned into tear gas. This turned into literally a war zone in the center of Cochabamba, where every block was students on one corner and police on the other, tear gas and rocks and all of this. And I'll never forget, in the middle of all this, I went in and I walked up to one of the police. And none of these were Cochabamba police. They sent in police from other cities because they knew the Cochabamba police would never go after their kin. Keep that in mind because it's going to replay itself last year. And I remember I went up to this guy, he's probably like 19, and I asked him in Spanish, I said, so if your captain asked you to shoot me, would you do it? It was a perfectly friendly conversation. He said, bueno, si es un orden, tengo que hacer. If it's an order, yeah. Oh, okay, well, I hope that doesn't happen. And then I just walked on. And that's this weird thing about how authority works. He was just following orders. I'm sure he was a perfectly nice guy. Repression is full of perfectly nice people who just are following orders. That's always been repression. That was Nazi Germany. It's just good people, but I'm in a system and I take orders and that's my job and I don't question the orders. In April of 2000, we had what they called in Bolivia la última batalla, which was when people shut down the city for a week. And this was the most violent and the most dangerous time. The government, and remember, this is the government of the former dictator Hugo Banzer. He could have done anything. He sends out all these soldiers. I am in the Plaza Principal of this city, and we are waiting. And the rumor is, están llegando las Dalmatas. The Dalmatas are coming. The Dalmatians are coming. They call them las Dalmatas. They're the federal police force that dresses up in this camouflage that looks like Dalmatians. And everybody thought they were about to come and start shooting because that's what we expected. And these teenagers, they hung a rope to the bell in the cathedral so that they could ring it and alert people. And we had no idea what was happening. And through a comedy of errors that I won't go into, the protest leaders were mistakenly told that the government was backing down. And all of a sudden, thousands and thousands of people who come from the countryside and elsewhere were filling the plaza. And my friend Oscar Oliveira, who was the labor leader, who was the voice of the water revolt, stands on his balcony saying, "We have won this great victory." And it turned out that that wasn't true, and the government imposed martial law. And during that weekend, a 17-year-old boy, Victor Hugo Daza, was shot in the face and killed, just blocks from the plaza. And it was then that I realized that the people weren't backing down, the government was killing people, and where's the company? So remember, this is 2000. The internet then was dial-up. There was no YouTube, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was like a handful of websites. It wasn't a lot. And I spent a morning researching and putting together the paper trail to document that, in fact, this mysterious company was, in fact, the Bechtel Corporation of San Francisco, which was very personal to me because they had basically come from San Francisco the same time I did, but very different intention. Our headquarters were literally like a mile apart in San Francisco. And so I went to my friend Oscar Oliveira and I said, "Oscar, give me a quote with the name Bechtel in it." And he said, "El sangre de los bolivianos ya están en las manos de Bechtel." The blood of Bolivian people is in the hands of Bechtel. And then I wrote an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, their hometown newspaper, saying that Bechtel was behind this. If you are a global conglomerate behind the deadly repression of indigenous people in Bolivia, you really don't want to have your headquarters in San Francisco.
Right. Right.
You really don't, which is why they were so careful to out themselves. I mean, to hide themselves.
Right.
It was a company behind a company behind a company, and I had to get that paper trail. And in the midst of this, the company finally, not because of my work, because of what Bolivians did, was forced to flee. And the water rates were rolled back. The company was retaken into being a public corporation, and that began the process of change, the proceso de cambio in Bolivia. Why? Because for decades, the government of Bolivia had been rotated between three political parties, all of which were the same. They had the same neoliberal economic policies, they had the same close ties to Washington, and they just had a gentleman's agreement that they would rotate power every 5 years so that each of them had a turn to steal, and then it would be someone else's turn. Suddenly that changed. The next year, well, actually a little later, 2003, the International Monetary Fund comes to Bolivia and says, "Thou shalt cut your budget deficit." And the advisors to the president say, well, the way to do that is to raise the taxes on foreign oil companies. And the president says, yeah, we're not doing that. And so instead, he imposes a tax, a new income tax, all the way down to people making $100 a month. And who rebels? The police,
Yay.
the nurses, the laborers, and a group of middle school students come to the plaza. So here's the police on one side of the plaza. Think about it as if it's Lafayette Plaza in Washington, D.C., and you have the police on one side and the National Army on the other in a standoff, and they're both armed. Into that comes this group of middle school students, and they go over to the soldiers guarding the palace, and they start throwing rocks at them. And the soldiers start firing tear gas. And then the kids run over to the police, who are all in their early 20s, and saying, "You got to protect the people. Hay que proteger el pueblo, pues." And they start shooting tear gas. We had a shooting war in the National Plaza between the police and the army over this IMF package, in which 34 people were killed. One of the first big pieces of research I did in Bolivia was I wanted to document the International Monetary Fund's role in this. And I'll never forget, this was the first line of a book chapter I wrote on this. From the penthouse office of the International Monetary Fund in La Paz, at the top of the central bank, you could see out its panoramic window to the roof of the building where Anna Kolke, a 22-year-old single mother and nurse, was shot and killed by an army sharpshooter when she had come to the aid of an injured handyman on the roof. I sat with her mother and her 3-year-old son, Luis, and listened to their story. I talked to the police. I talked to the IMF. I talked to the vice president. I talked to the advisors. I talked to all these people to piece this together. And this was what the Democracy Center then became. And all of these young people started showing up, people like you guys, started showing up and saying, "Oh, I read what you write," because I was doing this blog and it was getting read. And they said, "We want to help you." And so for 2 years, we basically had this crazy, essentially graduate seminar in writing, and they would go and do amazing work. There was this young woman from Portland, Oregon, who'd been a Peace Corps volunteer who wanted to do some work. And so she ended up documenting the story of a Shell Enron oil spill by going through a stack of documents this big. And then we went and got her a bike, and she spent 2 months on her own, bicycling around pueblos in the Altiplano, talking her way into people's homes, herding their animals with them, and capturing the story of how Shell and Enron had decimated the ecosystem of the highlands. This is what was going on in Bolivia for years. And now we come to Evo, Evo Morales. a name who has been in the news recently. And I don't know if any of you have read, I did a piece for the New York Review of Books called The Rise and Fall of Evo Morales. I don't know if anybody saw that, but you can get it online. It's a good point of reference. Evo is a man he's a great story, right? Here's a guy who was born dirt poor, who literally would like run after the tossed orange peels out of bus windows to eat. Then he and his family migrated to the Chapari, which is where the coca leaf was grown. And he became a coca farmer, rose through the ranks, became the union leader of the coca farmers, then formed a political party called MAS, Movimiento al Socialismo, the Socialist Party. And the first time he ran for president in 2002, he was really quite far behind until the US ambassador almost got him elected. There's a great, great movie, if you want to see it, called Our Brand is Crisis. There's actually two versions of it. There's the documentary version, which is when this brilliant US filmmaker got complete access to the campaign of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, the last of the really bad presidents. And she documents this. There was also a Hollywood version made that stars Sandra Bullock and Billy Bob Thornton that George Clooney produced as a comedy, which is actually a pretty fun movie to watch. And I sat with the scriptwriter, and so a lot of the stuff in there is stuff that I helped him figure out.
What is it called again?
Our Brand is Crisis. You can watch both of them. So the US ambassador, in front of a television audience, on national television the week before the election, basically threatens Bolivia. If you elect Evo Morales as president, we're going to cut off US aid. His support doubles overnight. I originally thought that that was just stupidity, but in fact it was strategy. They did that as a manipulative move. This was my belief. They did that as a manipulative move to help move votes between candidates to get the person elected that they wanted to get elected. But then in 2005, two things happened. The interim president, or the vice president who would become the president after a resignation, himself resigned, a guy named Carlos Mesa, who's one of the candidates running now. And I know Carlos Mesa, I've interviewed him. He's a smart guy, his politics are moderate. I think he's a decent, honest guy. And they could do worse. Then he resigned, and I love this story because he resigned, and I will never forget that night, and I just want to tell the story because it's so interesting. He resigned, and there was this really nice man named Eduardo Rodriguez, who was the president of the Supreme Court. And I say this because he and I are very good friends now. And he is literally home in front of the television in his pajamas when he gets a phone call from the president of the Senate saying, "Hermano, we've just cut a deal. The president will resign in exchange for the presidents of the two houses of Congress relinquishing their right to secession. The only way this works is if you become the president in half an hour." He said to me, I had to take off my pajamas, put on a suit, put on the presidential sash, and stand up in front of the Congress on national television and make up a speech. And then spend the night with the generals as I'm getting briefed about all the places where the miners in the army are getting ready to kill each other. He told me this next part with tears in his eyes. And I share this with you because it tells you something about the crazy nature of Bolivian politics. His son is 7 years old, and he wakes up the next morning and he looks at he's getting ready to go to school, and he looks out the window and there's like soldiers and TV cameras all over their front lawn. And his father's explaining to him. And he looks up at his dad and he says, "Papi, what are you going to do? You're the president." And when Eduardo told me that, he had tears in his eyes. You don't know the pressure. People come into the presidency planning it, and they have all this team. It was me. And he was president for 6 months, and his job was to deliver clean elections and go home. unlike the current interim president who doesn't get that. And those were the elections that delivered Evo Morales. Evo Morales' inauguration in Bolivia was just such a glorious moment. I mean, it was Nelson Mandela and Barack Obama rolled into one. I remember being with a man in a taxi who said, "Imagínate pues, un campesino va a ser presidente." A campesino is going to be, it was unheard of. It was less likely than Barack Obama being elected president. It was unheard, people were giddy. And the Capitol was full of Latin American celebrities. Eduardo Galeano and Hugo Chavez and Cárdenas from Mexico and everybody. It was just incredible. And I spent those 2 days with an old friend of mine, bless his heart, Tom Hayden, who came down to Bolivia for the inauguration. And he and I were just like in awe of all this. But my favorite moment, and I tell you these stories because I just want you to have a feel of the politics and the hope that moment represented. It was the greatest moment. Because remember, this was a president who, like, he would show up at summits with the King of Spain wearing this. Just like this, except his sweater wasn't as cool. You know? And they called it the Evo Chompa because it had these stripes and he looked like Waldo. So he gets up there, the inauguration happens, and then thousands and thousands, probably 100,000 people are in the Plaza San Francisco, literally in front of the building where Ana Coque was killed. And there are hundreds of thousands of people. And people are just like going out of their minds with giddiness. And he gets up there and he looks over and there's the vice president and the president of the House and he goes, "Hermanos, you know what? That presidential palace, it's way too big for just me. So I think the vice president and the president of the House, you should all come live with me. That would be your united government." And then he turns to the vice president's girlfriend in front of 100,000 people and he says, it's okay, he wouldn't have to sleep there every night. And I never loved Bolivia more than I loved it in that moment because it was like, that's who this was. And we were very close to the government in the beginning. I was very close to the vice president, Alvaro Garcia Linero. And Alvaro was in my office a few weeks before the inauguration. Actually, Evo was in my office right before the election, and my youngest daughter, who's 17 now, who was 3, looked up at him and said, "Vamos a bailar?" And it was just that kind of informality. So I said to Alvaro, I said, you know, you guys could be a lot more strategic about the United States. If I can help you, let me know. And so then I see him right before the inauguration, and he says, "Hermano, I've talked to Evo, you're going to be our advisor on the United States." I'm like, "No, I'm not. But I will help you. Like, I'm not going to have any formal relationship with the government, but I'll help you." And so I did. I was in Washington the week after the inauguration. I met with a whole bunch of people that wanted to be helpful to them. I came back, I called a friend of mine in the government, and I said, "Hey, I have a layover before I go home for a few hours. Do you want to talk?" And he says, "Let me call you back." And he says, "Alvaro wants to see you." So next thing I know, I'm like, haven't slept all night, and I'm in the presidential palace briefing the vice president on my meetings in Washington. And it was that kind of informality. I mean, like, we went, my interns and I went to a conference that the government had out at Lake Titicaca, and after the president and vice president left, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, David Choquehuanca, who's now the vice presidential candidate for the MAS, somebody told him, "Hey, David, you know they have a karaoke machine in the bar. No me digas." So next thing I know, we're all in the bar, and he is like belting out the Bee Gees like there's no tomorrow.
Oh my God.
And one of my interns comes over to me, we're dancing, and she goes, "I could never do this with Condoleezza Rice." And it was just that kind of wonderful informality. And the government did great things at the beginning. It told the IMF to go to hell, and the World Bank. It nationalized huge chunks of the oil and gas and these other industries. Bolivia had economic growth consistently through the entire global meltdown. It invested huge amounts of money in schools, in paving roads, in water systems. It built in La Paz one of the most glorious public transit systems on this planet, this system of gondolas.
Wow.
First class, that fly over the city. I talked to a young guy who was an avenida handyman who said, I used to have to spend 90 minutes each way every day on crowded buses, and now I fly in the air in half an hour. And I always have a seat, and it's quiet. These were glorious things. And then there were the things that weren't so glorious. Two in particular. The first was that while the government had this very terrific discourse on La Pachamama and Mother Earth and speeches at the UN and climate summits, its environmental policies in the country had absolutely no resemblance to that. We basically entered the third era of resource politics in Latin America. The first era was the conquistadors, which is if there's wealth under the ground, yank it out, give it to the king. The second era was the corporate era. If there's wealth under the ground, yank it out, give it to the corporations. The third era was the Evo era, which is if there's wealth under the ground, yank it out, and put it in the national treasury. So it was spent on better things, but it was still. I traveled to Oruro once to spend 2 days to do a workshop for a community of indigenous people who got up at 4 in the morning to walk to a highway and then take a bus to be with us. These were people who had loved Evo and whose town was being literally strip mined and the water destroyed. And they said, we don't understand. ¿Qué ha pasado con nuestro Evo? Why is he doing this to us? It's because the government had a very clear development model, which is we are going to put the gas pedal on resource extraction. We are going to become an energy exporter, and that's how we're going to become a highly developed country. And if it damages the planet, we don't give a crap. If it angers the people in the area, we don't care. And people were very nervous to speak up about this for a long time, because if you were on the left and you challenged the government, the way they went after you was just ruthless. You were demonized. You were called by the president a pawn of the US Embassy. It was like whack-a-mole. You know, anybody stuck their head up, the government immediately smashed it down. But it was there and it was growing. And it finally hit a head when this group of indigenous marchers headed to the Capitol to protect their rainforest, the Tipnis rainforest, from a highway that he was going to build through it. He met them with brutal repression. He sent out the troops. When the women were yelling, he literally had the soldiers put masking tape over their mouths. This was on live national television. Evo Morales, Mr. Pachamama, was putting tape over the mouths of indigenous women who dared to have the balls to criticize Evo Morales. And it was over and over and over again that this happened. The Morales administration was relentlessly bad on the environment. It was no different than any other government, because that's where the money was. We're going to get it out. The second thing that really undermined who he was an authoritarian streak. Democracy is a different word in Bolivia, because everybody over the age of 40 knows very well what it's like to live in a dictatorship. I have lots of friends who've told me about being tortured, having their father arrested, having their brother disappeared. These were people's real life experiences, so they watch very carefully when the government walks down a non-democratic path. And that's what happened. And it had to do with re-election more than anything else. So there's a reason that presidents have been traditionally limited to one term in Latin America. It's because it's just such a corrupt environment. So it's like, okay, one term and done. You can come back later if you want, but one term and done. So Evo and his party rewrote the Constitution saying you can have 2 terms. Okay, he ran for re-election, popular, got re-elected. And then he said, you know what? My first term doesn't count because it was under the old Constitution, so I'm going to run for a 3rd term. And everybody said, ¿Qué es esto? But you could make an argument, and so people didn't erupt. Then he announces, I want to run for a 4th term. I want to be in office for 20 years, at least, which is a really long time. Imagine if Trump was in office for 20 years.
Oh, please.
Imagine 90-year-old Trump. Not even that, like 97-year-old Trump. So his hair looking exactly like it does now, too. Melania, still Botox. Never mind, sorry, that's mean. And he said, but I recognize that the Constitution does not allow this. So I'm going to let the public vote, and I'll respect the outcome of the vote. So the public votes, and the public votes no. Not by a wide margin, but they vote no. Then he goes to the Supreme Court that he completely picked, and they say, you know what? His human right to run without limitation supersedes the Constitution.
Oh, geez.
Well, you know, I have to say this. The two politicians that remind me the most of each other in many ways, take away the ideological stands, in terms of governing style, there's a lot of similarities, unfortunately, between Trump and Abel. And it's the arrogance. It's the only I can make the revolution, only I. And
Mao Zedong, too.
what's that?
Mao Zedong.
Yep, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of egomaniacs.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
So this brings us to today. So in November of last year, we had this election with this dark cloud of illegitimacy over it. I mean, it was an illegitimate election to begin with. Like, there was no legal basis for him to run, but he ran. And so the right and the center merged together behind Carlos Mesa as sort of a moderate alternative. And the way the rules work in Bolivia is if you don't get a majority, but you finish 10 points ahead of your nearest competition, then you're automatically president. If it's less than 10%, you have to have a runoff. So the votes are being counted, and there's Evo just shy of 10%. And then suddenly, for 24 hours, for no apparent reason, the voting stops. The voting count stops. And when and all kinds of strange irregularities happen. And when the vote count is tallied up again, he has miraculously gone to just over 10%. Like I said, if you compare the way we took the stealing of an election in 2000 to the stealing of an election in Bolivia, it's a completely different world. People filled the streets in every major city in the country and said, no, no, no. Why did they do that? One is because there is this sort of underpinning of democracy. One is because there was an alliance of the far right in the middle. And a big reason is Venezuela. Bolivians have looked at Venezuela for the last 5 years, panicked out of their mind, whether they're poor or rich or middle class. That's the nightmare, right? That's the nightmare. And they've gauged. It's like, okay, economically we're okay, so we're not living that nightmare. How far down the road toward Maduro is Evo willing to go? I think what happened is it flipped the switches. If he is willing to literally steal an election, then that's where we're headed. And people didn't want to have any of it. The events of November have been written about, and I pardon my language, but I got a lot of shit for what I wrote. And I didn't mean to write about Bolivia again. When this was going down, I was in San Francisco, literally in the middle of my son's wedding to his fiance who had just come from Bolivia. And some of it is watching her. And then I kept getting emails from people saying, are you going to write about it? Are you going to write about it? We're getting so much, we need somebody who we trust to write about it. And so I started writing about it. And I learned about two things. One, what happened in Bolivia, and the other is this crazy world in which the left projects their shtick on Bolivia. And I made a decision that I was just going to write what I believed to be the truth, and I was not going to represent it as the truth. It was like, this is my perspective. If people have a different perspective, fine, but I'm not going to tailor what I write to avoid antagonizing people, which is why I got called by some a fascist tool, and by others an Evo apologist, which I was neither. So the big question is, was there a coup? I was pretty explicit in everything that I wrote that there was not a coup. And I'll tell you why I believe that. For weeks, the streets in Cochabamba and La Paz and Santa Cruz were filled with honest people. Some of them were crazy right-wingers and racist. A lot of them were just people, young people especially, who were like, no, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. When those kinds of movements toppled other governments in Bolivia that were right-wing governments, we never called it a coup, we called it democracy. Oh, but now it's a coup. Then the police, who were young, it started in Cochabamba, the police basically said, yeah, we've been sent into the street now for 3 days in a row to basically repress literally our families. Literally, there's my daughter. There was this one powerful picture of this cop embracing his daughter who was part of the and finally the police said, you know what, we're not having it. We are not going to be a tool of this game that the president is playing. And the police in Cochabamba, not the captains, not the leaders, the rank and file cops climbed to the roof of the police station in Cochabamba and said, yeah, no. No. And every police force in the country over the course of 2 days did that. So the police said, okay, we're not protecting you, so what's the story with the military? What happened there is known only to a few people. But at some point on a Sunday morning in the midst of all this, the head of the military, who was Evo's friend and an appointee, made a statement to the press saying, look, we think the only way the country is going to pacify is if Evo resigns. Like, we don't see another peaceful way forward. That was quickly latched upon, that's a coup, right? That's a coup. Is it the military putting its finger on the scale? Yes. Is that problematic? Yes. Is that the reason Evo Morales left and was kicked out of office? No. He was kicked out of office by the people. And like, I say this as somebody who, I loved this government in the beginning. I served this government in the beginning. These were my friends. The person whose judgment I trust the most, well, there were a lot of people, and I wasn't there, but I was on this daily clandestine Skype call with names that you would recognize if you know Bolivia, and I won't say them on camera, but former cabinet members, leading protest people. I was following the lead of people like Pablo Solon, who had been Evo's UN ambassador, his climate negotiator, and had broken with him over the environmental issues and the rest. So then for 2 days, nobody knew who the president was. There was no president. And during this time, I was texting by WhatsApp with Eduardo Rodriguez, the former president, who's a constitutional scholar, who was the ambassador to the Netherlands. And I never forget, it was this Sunday morning, and I go, Eduardo, who's the president? Eduardo writes, who knows? So the people in line resigned. The Mas people resigned. So this woman who no one ever heard of, who was the fourth in line, this right-wing Catholic fundamentalist steps forward and says, okay, then I'm the president. And that's where we stand. So now what we have is an election coming up in May in which lots of people are running. Mas, Evo's political party, has a slate. There are about 5 different moderate and right-wing candidates that will probably split the vote all over the place. There is at least 2, maybe 3 former presidents running. And the election is in early May with a runoff in June. And we don't know what's going to happen. And the interim president, whose job was to just deliver the elections and go home, announced that she's going to run, which means that once again we have somebody with their fingers in power who has a direct interest in manipulating the elections, which is how we got into this place. So that is about 10 times more than you need to know about Bolivia, but that's my wrap. And let me just say one more thing, and I'll talk a bit about Mexico, and then we'll open it up. As people who care about Latin America and who come to it from a progressive, pro-people, left, whatever you want to call us, we have an obligation to not fall into the trap of blind loyalty, of, okay, whose team am I on? Who's the left team? Okay, I'm on the left team. we did that for so far too long in Venezuela, and look what it delivered. We should have denounced that years ago before it got to this point. And when you do that, you piss people off. And I pissed plenty of people off doing this. But you know, somebody asked, what about the people as opposed to, or individuals versus big groups of people? I was on the phone every night with friends who were crying. I listened to them. Some of them were scared out of their minds because cocaleros were coming to their house. They were within 2 miles of their houses with dynamite. Other people were scared because they were Evo supporters and it had become unsafe for women in long braids to go out in the street. And people just wanted the violence to end. So you have to pay attention to all of that. Let me just quickly say a word about Mexico and then open it up. I'm sorry for talking so long, but I had that much coffee on my way here. I work with UNICEF on the issue of migrant children. Here are 3 things that you need to know. The first thing you need to know is that in a moment that nobody in this country paid any attention to, Donald Trump got his wall, and Mexico is paying for it. And he did it with a tweet in June that was a blip in this country in terms of attention and was a political earthquake in Mexico, which is Donald Trump tweeted, if the Mexican government doesn't stop immigrants from coming here, I will impose a 5% tariff on Mexican exports to the United States. Overnight, that completely and utterly changed the politics in Mexico. Because before that, the attitude was, este gente de Centroamérica, you know, they're a bother, it's kind of a pain, but you know, what are we going to do? We have to be good people, we have to support them. To, holy crap, these people are going to wreck our national economy. Stop them, whatever you want, stop them, whatever. So that's why asylum seekers now are stopped at the border. You're not allowed to go into the United States to request asylum. You are stopped at the border. This is why they are tear gassing children at the southern border, to keep them from coming. So that's fact number 1. Donald Trump got his wall and Mexico is paying for it, and the wall is called the government of López Obrador. Second thing you need to know is that Mexico has 3 completely different immigrant crises, migrant crises. One at the border, at the south, one at the border at the north, and one of all the people in transition. So you've got all these Central Americans coming from the south. And one of my questions when I went down, why are they so insistent on going to the United States? Why don't they just go to Mexico? You know the answer?
No.
It goes back to the first thing we talked about, which is the wars in Central America. What happened as a result of the wars in Central America? A lot of people migrated from Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador. So like, if I'm trying to get from Honduras and get a new life, and I have an uncle in San Diego or Los Angeles, that's where I want to go. So you have people who have family in the United States, and that's where they want to go because they know that's where they can start. You have people at the northern border who are trying to get into the United States, and they're stuck there, living in horrific conditions. And then you have a whole lot of people who are just sort of resettling in Mexico or on the way, and people like UNICEF are trying to figure out, how do we get kids in school? How do we get people health care? What do we do with them in the midst of all this? The last thing I want to say is, do you remember how there was this sudden appearance of immigrant caravans right about a month before the election in 2018? And the day after the election, they mysteriously disappeared. Get ready, because they're going to be huge.
This election.
No.
We're going to have bigger caravans, and it's going to be the invasion, and that's what we need to prepare for.
Were those real invasions or stories of convasions? Was there really a convasion?
No, and what you had immigrants got smart, which is, I could go up on my own, which is wicked dangerous, or I could go up in a group of 5,000 people, and there's some safety in that, and that's what people did. Okay, I've talked long enough. So questions, thoughts, disagreements. It is important to recognize that we're just looking at the preview of coming attractions. If you overlay climate change on Central America and you project 10 years into the future, we're not looking at caravans of 5,000. We're going to see caravans of 100,000 people. And the sooner that we start to figure out how to engage with Central America and deal with all of the crises that are coming to that region before it becomes unstoppable, the better. Because you have this wicked cycle of the climate crisis leads to a refugee crisis, and then the refugee crisis creates a political crisis. We've seen it undo the politics in Europe in the scope of very little time. We have seen it undo the politics of this country in one election, and we have barely scratched the surface of what's happening. So it's really important that we pay attention to that. Yes?
Why didn't Evo Morales train someone to have under him that would take over?
Isn't that a great question?
Yeah, I don't understand why he didn't do that.
He not only did he not do that, but anybody who could potentially be that, he got rid of them. The best person is my friend, the Bee Gees karaoke singer, David Chokiwanka, who was the foreign minister who people always thought would be groomed. And I was in his office with his deputy the week this happened. He left the government. And the reason he left the government is because a newspaper reporter asked him, do you think Evo should run for a fourth term? For Evo, the correct answer was yes. For David, the correct answer was the people should decide. And that was the end of his time in the government. He deliberately did not groom someone else because he wanted it to be only I. And that's why it's been very hard for Moss to recover. I mean, there's so many great people it could have been. It should have been a woman. So that's the answer. Yeah.
But it is mysterious that people that in the Moss party that were in line to succeed refused, right? So that it went down several
Yes.
layers before anyone was willing to grab the power. And that is a bit surprising, it seems, even if they weren't being groomed,
Right.
or they would have been frightened somehow.
And only they know the answer to that question. There's the theory that their families were threatened and they didn't want to deal with that, and that's a possibility. There's the theory that they were doing that that was an order from Evo, that basically, no, we don't want this to be some smooth line of succession where Evo's gone and now we have another Moss president, we can all be happy, this is what should have happened before. So again, you get into these circumstances where the truth is only known by a small group of people and everybody projects their politics onto it to say that's what happened. And my answer is, I don't know what happened, I haven't talked to them. What else? Yes?
What's the best thing for us here in Buffalo to do to help the people that are suffering as consequences of these political problems?
I think the most important thing you can do is to get engaged with the immigrant community.
Okay.
And, they need support. They need support right here in Buffalo. And I did a workshop a few months back with a whole group of immigrant rights activists. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting as an opportunity is, to me, and I've only lived in this area for 2.5 years, I was summoned here by my granddaughter from the womb and ended up staying. But Buffalo looks like a donut in that you've got Buffalo, the city of Buffalo, which has pretty progressive politics, has a lot of people like you folks, there's a lot of support for immigrants, and it is surrounded by places like Lockport, where I live. Niagara County, where I write a column for the Lockport Union Sun and Journal, which is a whole other story, which is great fun. Oh, it's great fun. And actually, do this tonight for fun. Google my name and the New York Review of Books, and you can read this really long, fun article I published a week ago called A Liberal in Trump Land, about my experience in Lockport. You will truly appreciate it. So, and we've got this clerk, right, who is obsessed that undocumented immigrants are going to register to vote and taint their elections. They can't even get citizens to vote in Niagara County. Somebody's gonna, like, I'm gonna risk deportation because I really want to vote on school board. I mean, come on. It's lunacy. It's political opportunism. So I think there's a real opportunity for people in Buffalo who are much more attuned and organized to start forming solidarity with some of these outlying Western New York communities. And so I think that would be a really good thing to do. So, but that's what I would do. I would start with the immigrant population here. And if you follow that thread, it will take you back to the kinds of reasons that they've come to this country. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. ¿Qué más? Yes.
So first, I just want to say, I'm so fascinated with all your stories.
Then you should come to the book event on the 7th,
Oh, absolutely.
because it's going to be even cooler.
It's right in that traffic jam of stuff that I was just telling you
Yeah,
about. But anyway, so, but if you would talk a little bit too about what you do in a more general way. So that these have been very specific and very informative and hitting on a lot of things that we could go a lot further about what is propaganda, or especially, I really appreciate your point about not picking sides, because we have this knee-jerk thing of supporting our friends.
We should always pick sides, and we should always pick the side of the people.
Right.
If you pick the side of the people, you'll be in good shape.
So what are some of the skills and activities or vehicles for getting some of the information and help out that you offer, or how you offer that help?
My mantra as an advocate comes from Sun Tzu and The Art of War, in which he said, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. I am obsessed with the fact that a huge amount of energy on the political left in this country, in the climate movement, in the immigrant movement, is full of well-meaning people who are operating tactically and who are not thinking strategically. And I might as well take a $20 bill out of my wallet and burn it, because that's a precious resource. So what I do is we do these strategy development workshops. And like I say, I've done them with indigenous communities in Bolivia. I've done them with the senior leadership of the UN. And it's the same. It took me 20 years and 5 minutes to figure the following thing out, which is no matter what advocacy you're doing, no matter what issue, no matter where you're doing it, there are 3 questions that are completely and totally universal. And I always tell people, I have no idea what the answers to those questions are for you, but I know that you have to ask and answer them in order to be strategic. And if you Google the art of advocacy strategy in my name, you will come to an article I wrote on this for Stanford Social Innovation Review a couple of years ago. And the 3 questions are, what do you want? What's the political map you have to navigate to get it? And what are you going to do? And I always use this case example of, I call it Mariana Wants a Bunny. And it's the story of my daughter's advocacy campaign when she was 7 to get a rabbit.
She got a rabbit.
And yes.
Yes.
And the point being that we come up with all this intellectual BS about strategy and all this. No. The most important thing the most important wisdom that you have about how to be strategic in your advocacy is what you learned in the first 18 years of your life, manipulating the crap out of every adult. Manipulating your parents and your uncles and your grandmother and your teachers and all these. That intuition is our power. And yet we leave it aside. And we come up with all these, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And I think that there are a lot of places where it's important to challenge ourselves into being more strategic. I'll give you an example that I'm hesitant to do it because I want to write about this after I've thought about it more. The climate strike. Let me tell it this way. In the 1980s, I was a part of what became the beginning of the resurgence of the access to healthcare movement, because the current access to healthcare movement began in Massachusetts and California. And then it became national under Clinton. And then it became everything it's become. But it started in California, in Massachusetts, and I was one of the founders of Health Access. If you had told me when I was in my early 30s, in the mid 80s in California, that I'd be standing here in my early 60s and we would still be fighting for comprehensive, universal access to healthcare, I would have been super depressed. And one of the things that being old gives you is a sense of the arc. That's a 30-year arc. We don't have a 30-year arc on climate. We don't even have a 10-year arc. And one of the things that makes me very nervous is that the strategies that people are organizing around climate are really the kind of strategies you deploy if you have a 30-year arc. And I work with people with what I call, what's your theory of change? Tell me what the dominoes look like. And if you look at the theory of change around the climate strike, it's basically, we're going to mobilize young people, awesome. We're going to give young people a voice, awesome. We're going to raise that voice and yell really loud, awesome. And in response, the political system will bend to our will. Yeah, no. That's just like, that's not how it works. And it's specifically not how it works on an issue where there's such entrenched interests. And let me give you an example. We've set this up as, this is us versus the oil companies. We're going to have that fight, us versus the fossil fuel industry. It's like, well, where I live in Niagara County, we're having a battle royal over the siting of solar panels in agricultural areas. And I've been to those meetings. I completely understand where those people are coming from. Like, if you listen to them, or the battle over wind power on Lake Ontario is even more important, right? Because you look at that and the Sierra Club is so proud. You know, we're going to close down that coal plant in Somerset, the last 2 coal plants in the state of New York, and we're going to give them windmills. How could they not be happy? Well, you talk to the people there, first of all, yeah, you shut down our coal plant, so hasta la vista revenue base under our schools. Thank you for that. And it was only operating like 7 days a year because of the way the grid works. And the windmills, it's like you wanted us to take 70 windmills the size of the Washington Monument and put them on Lake Ontario. And so there's this lack of knowledge of, there's environmentalists in places like New York who have all these great ideas. Those people are the stewards of the land. Do you know what I mean? Like, they live on the land, they take care, they're environmentalists in a different way. And when they say we don't want windmills, it's not because we don't want windmills because they look ugly. Or we don't want solar panels because they look ugly. It's like, no, because they're being told all kinds of things that may or may not be true about what if lightning strikes and a bunch of the glass breaks, you have broken glass all over this ag land? Or what about these batteries that are going to be part of the storage that are lithium? And what's the deal there with their, and people are saying, you know, think about what they're doing. It's actually an honorable thing, right? Because what they're saying is, yeah, we could make money, but you're not going to buy us off because we're not convinced it's not going to harm our land. Now, there's a lot of misinformation as part of that, but I'm saying that's where the complication is. And just saying we need climate action without getting our fingers dirty into why people are resistant to the kinds of things that need to be done. That, to me, is what we have to be doing. And then one last thing, and then I see your hand up. I think the operative metaphor for what we need to be doing are those bicycles that you pedal and they generate electricity. It's 2 for 1, right? You're getting exercise and you're generating electricity. my dream is that we come up with a method of protest that also, at the same time, actually does something real, that actually pulls carbon out of the atmosphere. One of the things that I'm worried is going to happen is one of the things we could do is we could get people as protest to plant trees, because that's real. But now everybody's going to say we can't do that because Donald Trump said we should plant trees, so that's obviously a bad thing. And this is what I mean is we're not being strategic. And so you asked what we do. We try to sit down with people and help them think in a strategic way, because we can't afford to become the noise before defeat. There just isn't time on these issues for us to be the noise before defeat. Yes?
I got two questions. First, how do you approach the people in Niagara County, the land stewards, the stewards of the land, and impart to them the importance of putting those 600-foot wind turbines and solar panels, because we do need that energy. Number two, Bolivia has, I understand, one of the largest resources of lithium around, and that's the new gold. And what role did lithium have to play in the transition to the new government?
Okay. I'll answer those, and then I think we're going to wrap up, because I have to go either home or to a hospital. I have to find out which. The answer to your first question is that's completely the wrong approach. Like going to them and saying, it is your moral responsibility to like, you have to put solar panels on your land, otherwise we won't have clean energy to put all those pretty lights on in Times Square. Like, yeah, people aren't having that. Do you mean like that, this whole thing of it's their responsibility, that's where the land, like that can't be the conversation.
What's the conversation?
The conversation is, first of all, what does it actually mean to put these panels? People have questions. People have real questions. I went to a meeting, this is a real eye-opener for me. I went to a meeting out in Royalton. It was at the town hall, it was the Volunteer Fire Services Hall. I felt like I was in another country again. Of, 200, 250 people packed into this hall. 2/3 of the vehicles in the lot were pickups, no question. It was Republican, conservative. The meeting began with the Pledge of Allegiance. I noticed we didn't start this meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. We also didn't have a prayer. Although, as my wife pointed out, the prayer that they gave sounded an awful lot like the kind of reflective things you might say at the beginning of a lefty meeting. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. But dear Lord, help us to be good neighbors with one another, to listen to one another, to rise above conflict and see what's best for our community. So one is just understanding, and they have a lot of questions, and nobody is really answering their questions. And they feel like they're being had, like they're being taken advantage of. And we need to address that. And so the Sierra Club, right? Think about it. This is the environmental group that led the closure of their coal plant. That was a drive-by. It wasn't because they said, wow, this is really going to affect the climate. It's because we want to be able to say we closed the last 2 coal plants in New York State. Aren't we awesome? And that's going to be great for our fundraising. And these people are like, yeah, have you really looked at what you just did? And now that we want to repurpose it as a data center to replace those jobs and revenue, where are you? Why aren't you leaning on Cuomo to support that? So there's just this mistrust because we're not listening to them. Read this piece I wrote in the New York Review of Books, because it's a lot about my experience of if you go into those spaces from the starting point of respect, what do you hear? And you hear a lot. And I guess that's my experience having lived out of the country for 19 years, is I was constantly in spaces with people who had a completely different life experience, and I had to learn respect. Last thing on lithium. Oh, people have been saying that lithium in Bolivia is the new gold forever. We published a long, detailed report on lithium in Bolivia. On the one hand, Bolivia is being really smart. because they know that in resource economics, you don't want to sell raw material. But that's not where the money is made. I learned this my first year in Bolivia from Victor the plumber, who I hung out with for the day while my pump in my water system was broken. And he spent the morning teaching me opera and the afternoon teaching me economics. It was great. And he'd say, no, because we don't want to like just sell everything as raw product. You make the money by making stuff out of it. It's like, oh yeah, Victor, you're really smart. So do you think my pump works now? And so Bolivia wants to do that. But on the one hand, you're taking a place where the current state of technology is that if you go to the nicest hotel in the area, and there's like 3, for an hour a day in the middle of the day, you might get hot water. It's a bit of a leap to, we're going to start manufacturing auto batteries for the Prius in a place where if anybody gets mad, they can just shut down the highway. And executives will come here and not have hot water. And it's a leap to do that. And so they've been trying to make that leap for years. The other thing is that it's really hard because to do that, they have to invest, I can't remember the figure, but it's like $2 billion to fully develop that. And it's like jumping off a diving board into a pool that's empty with the promise that by the time you get to the bottom, there'll be water in it. And the thing with lithium is in 10 years, is that really going to be what they make the batteries out of? Or is it going to be something else? Because anybody with a Samsung phone knows that lithium is not the most stable element in the world. And there's a lot of reasons that lithium is problematic, and so Bolivia is in this kind of stuck place. The conspiracy theory is, no, this was all about getting their hands on, no, they didn't have to do that. Ava was negotiating all over the place with companies to help develop the lithium. Like, instability is not what, if you're an international investor looking to put money into a country, it's not like, first let's make it super politically unstable. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. No, you want stability, and AVO offered that stability, if anything. All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay, April 7th, 7 o'clock at Buen Vivir Gallery. Come, it'll be fun.
You should come to some of the peace walks.